In one of the salons of the Hôtel de Crillon in Paris, May 1925, the same headlines kept echoing everywhere. Keeping the Eiffel Tower standing was expensive, and it was starting to annoy some bureaucrats. People argued about its usefulness, its costs, its future. And out of those whispers, an extraordinary public auction was born, quiet as a secret, dressed up like a high-level government deal. The 5 biggest scrap metal dealers in Paris were in the room. At the head of it all, the supposed government representative, Victor Lustig. Among those 5 men, one stood out for all the right and wrong reasons: André Poisson. Ambitious, hungry to move up a level. The perfect target for a confidential opportunity in the name of state secrecy. Coincidence? Not exactly. Outside on the Champ de Mars, Poisson and Lustig stopped beneath one of the iron pillars. Poisson, in a light-colored suit that fit just a bit too tight, adjusted his tie like someone trying to squeeze into a bigger world. Lustig, wearing gloves, unfolded an official-looking document with the seal of the French Republic. The red stamp read "Confidentiel." "If approved, the dismantling will be quick, done at night, and completely silent," he whispered. An envelope changed hands. Numbers, timelines, signatures, government stamps, and that old familiar hint of a courtesy payment to speed things up with certain officials. Poisson nodded. In his mind, the tower already had an owner. Him. On paper, everything always looks easy. Right there, in that moment, Victor Lustig stamped his name into history with one of the boldest scams Paris had ever seen. He sold a national symbol without removing a single bolt. And the best part, or the worst, he actually thought about doing it again. Some made fortunes in seconds. Others lied for years. Some fooled kings, others fooled the entire world. This isn't a channel about ordinary crimes. It's about brilliant lies, dirty moves, and dangerously clever minds. Real scams, legendary con men, and the dark side of money. Welcome to Dirty Game. The absurd story of the man who sold the Eiffel Tower. Bohemia at the end of the 19th century wasn't a place out of a fairy tale, but a land of contrasts. In small towns with narrow streets and houses pressed tightly against one another, quiet poverty lived side by side with an obsession over appearances. That was the world Victor was born into, a home where almost nothing was left over, but where education was treated as the only inheritance his parents could give him. His father, a low-ranking civil servant, didn't have much money, but he had a discipline that felt almost military. His mother, more sensitive, insisted that the boy learn music, good manners, and foreign languages. While other kids ran through the streets, Victor was pushed toward the out-of-tune piano in the living room, toward French recited out loud, toward German learned from worn-out books. Little by little, they noticed something unusual. The boy didn't just memorize, he imitated. He copied accents, expressions, gestures. He could reproduce with unsettling precision the way a teacher walked, the way a priest took a breath before a sermon, or the way a shopkeeper laughed when closing a deal. This natural talent for observation wasn't just a game. Victor paid attention to details adults ignored. The way wealthy people greeted each other with a slight tilt of the head, how ladies adjusted their gloves before entering a parlor, the respectful silence that fell when someone well-dressed walked through the door. He didn't just see people, he saw codes, and he understood earlier than most that whoever controls the code controls the situation. School became his first stage. While teachers saw him as a diligent, focused, polite student, his classmates got used to a different side. Victor always knew an easier way to get things done. A copied assignment here, a perfectly organized cheat sheet there, a whispered answer at just the right moment. It never felt forced. He didn't beg people to trust him. He made them come to him. All he had to do was seem confident, calm, just a bit above everyone else, and the rest followed. At home, his mother was proud of his progress. The boy could play simple pieces on the piano, dance with a certain elegance at local parties, and greet strangers with almost aristocratic politeness. What his family saw as a sign of refinement, Victor felt as something else, a mask in the making. Clean clothes, straight posture, gentle words, all of that worked like a ticket into places where, by income and background, he wasn't supposed to belong. Cards became his second school. In smoky taverns and quiet back rooms, he watched older men bet money they couldn't afford to lose. He noticed trembling hands, quick glances, frustrated sighs. He saw how greed erased reason, how the urge to win back what I lost was the perfect hook. When he finally sat down at the table, he didn't try to win by being aggressive or taking wild risks. He chose to win by reading people. Before looking at the cards in his hand, he studied his opponent's face. In that world, his core rule took shape: never force the con, make the mark want to believe. It wasn't about shoving a lie down someone's throat. It was about offering a dream that sounded just believable enough for the other person to cling to it on their own. If someone wanted to feel smarter, Victor made them feel special for understanding the deal. If they wanted to look bold, he presented the opportunity only the brave can recognize. His first scams were low risk, almost like experiments. A Swiss watch that wasn't all that Swiss, sold to a traveler convinced he had bargained like a genius. A lottery ticket passed on at the last minute to an acquaintance desperate to believe in sudden luck. Documents with fake letterheads, carefully designed, used to open doors to hotels and salons where he would never be welcome if he showed up as who he really was. None of that looked extraordinary at first glance, but the internal mechanics were precise. Victor never chose someone who didn't have a hidden need, wounded pride, oversized ambition, hunger for status. He didn't just create a story, he created a feeling. The target had to feel ahead of everyone else, sharper, faster, better connected. Once that feeling took hold, the con was already halfway done before any money actually moved. Along with his talent for acting came another lesson: the art of disappearing. In every city, a new name. In every boarding house, a different story about where he came from. Sometimes he was a merchant's son, sometimes a law student, sometimes a young diplomat traveling on assignment. He never stayed in one place for too long. A friendly face, a few bills paid on time, a generous tip for the waiter, and by the time someone started putting the pieces together, he was already at another address, another boarding house, another country. The passport wasn't just a document, it was a flexible concept. Fluent in several languages, Victor changed accents like other people changed coats. After just a few days in a new city, he copied the locals' way of speaking, learned which family names carried weight, and which neighborhoods gave instant prestige to anyone who claimed to live there. He understood something simple and cruel. The world doesn't really ask if something is true. It asks if it looks true. Over those years, the persona solidified. An impeccable gentleman who knew how to talk about classical music, quote French authors, and comment on politics with what sounded like real depth. From the outside, he looked like just another well-educated young man with refined manners. But behind that polished surface, something more dangerous was forming. A man who was learning more and more to measure people not by their character, but by their vulnerability, and who was beginning to realize that in a world obsessed with status, the one who sells the illusion often has more power than the one who actually owns what he shows off. When Europe started crawling out of the rubble of the war, the big transatlantic liners became more than ships. They were floating hallways between ruins and skyscrapers. Poor ports shipped out passengers into crystal salons filled with electric light and live orchestras. For many, those crossings meant a new beginning. For Victor, they meant something else. A closed human laboratory, rich, contained, and predictable. On the first-class decks, the war felt far away. Industrialists talked about reconstruction. Bankers argued over exchange rates. Heirs showed off fortunes. Widows looked for safety in new advisors. It was a crowd filtered by two traits: money and vanity. Victor noticed that on his very first voyage, and understood that here he could refine his craft with controlled risk. He introduced himself as a businessman, tied to banks or import firms in Central Europe. He adjusted the story to fit whoever was in front of him. With a diplomat, he talked treaties. With an industrialist, tariffs. With a widow, stability. He never gave a full resume. He left blank spaces, and in those spaces, people projected whatever they wanted to see: influence, access, power. The first lesson from the liners was clear. Luxury numbs suspicion. Heavy curtains, silverware, perfect uniforms. Everything told the passenger that they were safe from cheap dangers. Someone who paid a fortune for a cabin didn't want to see themselves as a target. They wanted to see themselves as chosen. Victor learned to pull on exactly that silent pride. He started with card games, a territory he already knew. He didn't try to win too much. He tried to build a reputation. He lost a few rounds, praised his opponents, dropped edited stories about deals too complicated for this table. As the nights went by, the conversations shifted toward exchange rates and opportunities in America. He listened more than he spoke, asked sharp questions, and let a technical comment slip here and there, just enough to look like someone who could see a bit further than the rest. In that environment, the first currency scams were born. In a rebuilding continent, European currencies were collapsing, the dollar was getting stronger, and almost no one really understood what was happening. Victor presented himself as a man with access to banks in different countries, able to take advantage of short windows of arbitrage. From his briefcase, he pulled out documents with convincing seals, forged bank letters, receipts, contracts. The paper felt right, the crest looked real. The mark saw exactly what they wanted to see: legitimacy. The deals were discreet. A sum exchanged here, another there, promises of settlement at banks in New York or Vienna. By the time the ship reached port, Victor had already vanished to another city, another cabin, another name. Anyone who realized the loss later would first have to admit publicly that they'd been naive in the middle of the ocean, something very few were willing to do. More than just running scams, Victor used every crossing to sharpen his ability to read bodies. He watched the sparkle in someone's eyes when they heard the word opportunity, the tightening of the jaw when the subject was risk, the automatic gesture of adjusting a tie or jewelry when talking about status. He learned to measure, in seconds, how much a passenger was willing to risk just to feel special. If he sensed hesitation, he backed off. If he smelled inflated vanity, he moved in with one more confidential detail. Soon came the quiet investments. He spoke of factories in Central Europe being sold for almost nothing, devalued real estate, contracts with local governments desperate for capital. He offered reserved participation before it reaches the big banks. The devastation of the post-war world was the perfect backdrop. All he had to do was stitch a few real facts to very well-forged papers. It was during this phase that one conviction hardened in him. Documents and letterheads open more doors than any gun. A pistol can force someone to hand over a wallet. An envelope with the logo of a respected bank can make a person hand over their entire savings and still say thank you. While other con men relied on sleight of hand at the table, Victor invested in paper, ink, and research. He read newspapers, wrote down the names of institutions, copied writing styles. The ships themselves gave him the perfect structure. The crossing ran on a strict schedule. Time worked in his favor. The first nights were for observation, the middle days for getting close, and the last ones for closing the deal. As the ship neared the harbor, he delivered the final push. If you want to take advantage of this window, we'll have to move before we disembark. The urgency didn't sound like pressure, it sounded like a favor. Over time, a vague reputation began to drift around. In different ports, certain people remembered seeing that polite businessman on another ship, on another route. Sometimes the name changed, but the well-cut suit, fluent French, and measured smile tied it all together. The human mind hates admitting inconsistencies, so it quietly filled in the gaps in his favor. The school of the transatlantic liners taught Victor something he would carry for the rest of his life. In a world obsessed with status, the perfect scam isn't just taking someone's money. It's making them pay to buy a bigger version of themselves. Out at sea, between Europe and the United States, he learned how to sell that promise, and how to disappear the moment the ship touched the dock. Paris, 1925. The city showed off modern life in shop windows, cafes, and glowing posters, but it still carried fresh scars from the war. Between loud cars, demobilized soldiers, and curious tourists, the Eiffel Tower still stood there, like a giant iron skeleton watching over the Seine. For many Parisians, that monument was no longer a symbol of the future. It was a budget problem. Victor arrived in this Paris with something most foreigners didn't have: a memory of the city and a trained eye. He didn't just see boulevards and landmarks. He saw moods, complaints, trends. In hotels, he listened to conversations about taxes, inflation, and reconstruction costs. In cafes, he read local newspapers like someone panning for gold in mud. And in one of those readings, he found the spark that would turn a national symbol into an asset. A small, seemingly harmless column mentioned the cost of maintaining the Eiffel Tower. It talked about rust, repairs, and uncomfortable numbers for the public budget. A bureaucrat was quoted complaining that the structure had already served its purpose and now dragged down the city's finances. For most readers, it was just another government gripe. For Victor, it was raw material. He started collecting clippings. Small notes in different papers showed a pattern. The tower, once celebrated as a triumph of engineering, was now criticized as an expensive eyesore, an iron monster some people would love to see taken down. There was no official demolition plan, but there was something even more useful: noise, frustration, conflicting opinions. Where the public saw debate, he saw a ready-made story to be exploited. His logic was simple and brutal. If there was public discussion about the tower's costs, it was believable that some part of the government might be thinking about getting rid of it. And if that seemed believable, it could be sold. The idea didn't need to be true. It just had to sound possible to someone with a lot of money, not enough skepticism, and a big ego pushing them forward. Before making a move, Victor studied the ecosystem around iron and scrap. He quietly checked business records, talked to hotel staff, and scanned ads in trade papers. He identified the big scrap dealers, owners of companies that handled metal on a large scale, used to public contracts, bids, and the back rooms of the state machine. They were rough men with a craving for respectability. They didn't just want to be seen as junk dealers. They wanted to be called industrialists, partners in progress. That was exactly the kind of ego he was looking for. Once he had his list of names, he moved to the next phase: manufacturing reality. On carefully forged letterhead, documents appeared that looked like they came from a government ministry. The crest of the French Republic was drawn with precision, the official tone copied from real state papers. The stamps mimicked with thick ink. The content was calculated. Due to the high costs of maintenance and the need for urban reorganization, the government is considering the disposal of the metal structure known as the Eiffel Tower through a confidential process of selecting qualified scrap contractors. The key word wasn't sale or disposal. It was confidential. By hinting that the process had to remain secret, Victor pushed several buttons at once: fear of public scandal, the desire to be on the inside, and the feeling of being privileged. If a scrap dealer believed he was involved in something exclusive and politically sensitive, he'd be less likely to talk, ask too many questions, or bring in outsiders. Silence stopped being just caution and became part of the game. All that was missing now was the stage. And it couldn't be just any office. Victor picked a luxury hotel, one of those places where heavy curtains and glittering chandeliers already act as a silent stamp of legitimacy. A private salon, discreet waiters, a partial view of the city. That's where he decided to hold his confidential meetings. The contrast was deliberate. Discuss the fate of the Eiffel Tower in a place where the guests themselves felt like they were part of the elite that decides the fate of national symbols. The more the setting screamed power and respectability, the less the guests questioned the paperwork. Before the meetings, letters were mailed to the selected scrap dealers. The tone was formal, almost cold. They were informed that due to the political sensitivity of the matter, only a few trusted names had been chosen for a possible operation to dismantle the Eiffel Tower. Their presence was requested to discuss terms and confidentiality, with a set date, time, and place. The sender, a supposed high-ranking official with an illegible signature and an impressive title. When the day came, the men walked into the hotel carrying a mix of anxiety and pride. Some had never set foot in such a refined place. They pulled their best suits out of the closet, ironed their shirts, put on cologne. They didn't want to look out of place. They wanted to look worthy of what they imagined was a state deal. Victor greeted them with the attitude he had spent years perfecting. Elegant, calm, unhurried. He didn't overdo the politeness. He behaved like someone who did this kind of thing all the time. He introduced himself as a government representative in charge of quietly handling a possible disposal of the tower. He talked about numbers in vague terms, mentioned political pressure, and stressed the need to avoid negative public reaction. Everything was said in a confidential tone, almost conspiratorial. The room did the rest. Seeing other businessmen walk in and out of nearby rooms, hearing fine silverware being set in the restaurant, noticing how the staff treated the gentleman who had summoned them. All that confirmed, deep down, the story they wanted to believe. This was a real, serious, high-level process. If their mind resisted for a second, their vanity finished the job. The iron idea was now fully formed. Turn the public debate over the usefulness of the Eiffel Tower into a secret, profitable operation. Use bureaucratic frustration as cover. Dress the con in official paperwork and luxury staging. It wasn't just about selling steel. It was about selling the feeling of sitting at the same table as power. By the end of that setup, Victor no longer saw the tower as a monument. He saw tons of metal converted into narrative. Every bolt, every beam, every iron arch was, in his mind, one more argument to convince someone that dismantling the structure could be the opportunity of a lifetime. All he needed was one buyer, ambitious enough, insecure enough, and hungry enough for recognition. In a country trying to rebuild its image and its books, men like that were everywhere. What was missing was someone willing to offer, with just the right elegance, the chance to buy a piece of the city itself. The plan was in place, but one crucial piece was still missing: the right prey. It wasn't enough to find someone with money. Victor needed a man with the exact combination of traits: enough capital, wounded ambition, a hunger to be accepted in higher circles, and a deep insecurity, hidden behind an expensive watch and a handshake that tried a little too hard. He started with lists of mid-level industrialists and merchants, not the big names who had advisors, lawyers, and solid reputations. He preferred the ones who'd gotten rich fast, usually on the edge of old Parisian high society. Men who owned factories, warehouses, contracts, but still felt treated as new money by the traditional salons. At every meeting in the hotel lobby, in every casual conversation at reception, Victor watched who hesitated, who got excited, who stayed too quiet. One man caught his attention immediately: the owner of a scrap and metal company. He wasn't poor at all, but his body carried the weight of someone who'd gotten used to being looked down on. Well-cut suit, but slightly off. Manners well-rehearsed, but not always natural. In conversation, he showed pride in every achievement, and at the same time a certain resentment for never being seen as truly respectable. He was exactly the kind of man who would dream of one big shot that finally put him on another level. Victor didn't move in right away. He let the man notice him first. He arrived at the hotel in a rented but luxurious car. The staff greeted him with respect, some of it genuine, some of it carefully purchased with generous tips. In earlier meetings with other scrap dealers, he made sure to leave stamped letters in plain sight, folders full of impressive documents, references to ministries and directors. He never explained everything, but always said enough for anyone nearby to think, who exactly is this guy? When he finally decided to get closer, he did it with calculation. In a casual tone, in the lobby, he remarked how some of the guests seemed more prepared than others to handle a project of this size. That was all it took to light the fuse. The industrialist, desperate to prove himself, started the conversation. Within minutes, he was talking too much about his experience with large metal structures. his capacity to dismantle, transport, and resell. Victor listened carefully, mixing in quiet compliments and technical questions that made it clear he knew the subject very well. The first hook was in. At the next meeting, now in a private room, Victor changed the tone. He laid out the context as if he were sharing a state secret. He talked about the massive costs of maintaining the tower, the pressure from some parts of the government to find a solution, the need to avoid public scandal. Just imagine, my friend, what would the newspapers say if they found out France is thinking of dismantling its own symbol? Framed that way, the operation sounded both absurd and dangerously believable. The industrialist hesitated. And it was in that hesitation that Victor pushed in deeper. He lowered his voice, leaned slightly forward, and dropped the key piece of the performance. Not only was this a real operation, but there were already other interested parties. Groups with better connections had already been contacted. Time was short. The urgency wasn't presented as pressure, but as an opportunity about to slip away. Victor carefully implied that the final choice could be influenced, a word that, in certain environments, works like an open invitation. He spoke of adjustments, of considerations without ever saying the word bribe, but letting it hang in the air with all the weight it didn't need spelled out. The industrialist understood, and more importantly, he accepted the unspoken code that this deal wouldn't happen on paperwork alone. He didn't just want to make money off the iron. He wanted to stand next to the decision makers. To seal the illusion, Victor arranged what he called a technical visit. A car took him and the supposed government representative to the base of the Eiffel Tower. There was nothing officially restricted about it. Anyone could walk around there. But the way the visit was staged changed everything. A guide, previously bribed, led them around, talked about the structure, numbers, and metal weight. Victor, briefcase under his arm, pointed at beams, mentioned costs, and reinforced the story. All of this, if dismantled properly, could turn into one of the most profitable contracts of this decade. The industrialist looked at the tower like he'd never seen it before. He no longer saw tourists' history or national pride. He saw tons of iron, weight, volume, money. In his mind, he saw himself as the man chosen to solve the problem the government didn't dare expose in public. The fantasy of recognition, fed for years by quiet resentment, finally had a concrete shape. Back at the hotel came the final stage. Victor presented documents outlining in vague but official-sounding language the terms of the confidential disposal. There were clauses about secrecy, mentions of political compensation, approximate dates. Nothing there would survive serious scrutiny. But the industrialist wasn't interested in questioning it. He was interested in believing it. The letterheads, stamps, fancy setting, and Victor's calm, confident posture were more comforting than any real legal guarantee. The payment issue was introduced not as a simple price, but as a problem to be solved. There would be facilitation costs, advance guarantees, administrative fees that obviously couldn't appear in any official document. It was a delicate game, just enough to make the target understand he was stepping into a gray zone deal, and therefore couldn't run to the light if something went wrong. In the end, the industrialist agreed. He agreed because he wanted more than metal. He wanted a leap in status. He agreed because he believed he was being admitted into the backstage of power. He agreed because deep down he felt like he was cheating the system by joining something off the record. He didn't realize that this time, he was the system. The payment was made in stages, part by transfer, part in cash. Each installment came with more theater, a new letter, a new secret meeting, a new gesture of apparent trust from Victor. Until, at a certain point, there was nothing left to pay and nothing left to receive. Only the promise of a future contract to be formalized soon. Soon never came. Before suspicion could turn into action, Victor was already leaving Paris. The same elegance he used to enter, he used to disappear. New hotel, new name, new route. By the time reality finally began to sink in for the industrialist, the man he thought he could confront was already just a fading trail on the road to Austria. He was left with a bitter choice: report the scam and publicly admit he had been fooled on a massive scale, or stay silent to protect his image. To denounce it would mean confessing that he had tried to join a shady deal involving a national monument. It would mean admitting he agreed to pay under the table to gain an advantage over competitors. In the final balance, the fear of shame spoke louder. He chose silence. And that's how the first sale of the Eiffel Tower was completed as the perfect con. Money collected, escape flawless, victim gagged by his own vanity. The city, moving along between cafes and boulevards, kept believing its iron tower had never been touched, never imagining that, behind the scenes, it had already been sold once. Sold so convincingly that no one dared tell the story out loud. The success of the first operation left a double mark on Victor, a heavier wallet, and the dangerous illusion that he had tamed Paris. The city that had swallowed countless small-time crooks had, this time, been treated like prey. The con had been clean, quiet, perfect. And it's exactly when everything looks perfect that vanity starts whispering, "You can do it again." Without waiting long, a few weeks later he came back to Paris. The streets looked the same, but the atmosphere didn't. In the newspapers, vague notes appeared about dishonest speculators and shady deals involving public contracts. Nothing mentioned the Eiffel Tower. Nothing pointed directly to him. But Victor knew how to read between the lines. Someone, somewhere, had complained just enough to create noise, even if that noise was smothered by shame. Even so, the temptation to repeat the plan spoke louder. He reasoned that if it had worked once with no trace, a second time, with more caution, could double his profit. The method was already tested. The documents were ready. The luxury hotel was still available. The whole performance, in theory, could be recycled. And despite the subtle warning signs, he decided to move forward. The preparations started again. New letters were drafted on forged letterhead, this time with small tweaks in language and format based on his earlier experience. Invitations went out to a different group of scrap dealers and industrialists, but right from the first contacts, something felt off. The replies came slower. Some declined immediately, citing other urgent matters or no interest in confidential operations. The word confidential, once so seductive, now triggered caution. Still, one candidate stood out. The owner of a solid, well-established company with contacts inside the city government. He wasn't as insecure as the first victim, but he had a different kind of weakness: the drive to consolidate power. He didn't need to prove he was someone. He wanted to prove he was above the others. Victor saw an opening in that, but this time the target also saw openings, not just opportunities. The first meeting at the hotel took place under a slightly heavier air. The industrialist arrived with an assistant who stayed quiet, watching everything and taking notes. He wasn't the type to be dazzled by chandeliers or plush carpets. He looked at the seals on the documents, asked exactly which department the authorization came from, name-dropped ministers, and mentioned laws governing public contracts. This wasn't a man from the sidelines. This was someone used to walking actual government hallways. Victor kept his composure. He answered with polished evasions, used bureaucratic jargon, mentioned special commissions and exceptional government procedures. He handed over documents to be seen, but never left them in anyone's hands for long. He dodged some questions with the trained skill of a man who always counted on the other side's lack of technical knowledge. But he noticed one uncomfortable detail. The look in the man's eyes wasn't that of someone hypnotized by opportunity. It was the look of someone weighing risk. A few days later came the second meeting, and with it, a more worrying sign. Before going into the room, Victor noticed two men in the lobby who didn't look like regular guests. Well-dressed, yes, but not behaving like people there to enjoy the place. They watched more than they relaxed. One flipped through a newspaper without really reading it, eyes on the front desk. The other casually scanned the side entrances. Instinct, faster than thought, lit up a warning. This smelled like police, or at the very least, people way too interested in who was coming and going. He hid his discomfort and went on to the meeting. The industrialist was colder this time. He said he had made some checks. He commented, without too much detail, that he couldn't find any official record of the supposed commission in charge of dismantling the tower. He asked if there was some decree not yet published, or an internal order that could be shown, even in strict confidence. Inside, Victor knew he was standing on a rug that could be pulled from under him at any moment. Instead of backing off immediately, he tested the resistance. He spoke of layers of secrecy, of decisions that, for political reasons, couldn't yet appear in public records. He hinted that some lawmakers were divided and that leaks could kill the project. Turning the lack of proof into a sign of exclusivity is an old trick, but it doesn't always work. The industrialist listened but didn't buy in. He asked about other interested parties and mentioned the possibility of checking with a friend in the ministry just to make sure everything was in order. That's where the risk line became crystal clear. Victor realized the environment had changed since the first operation. The police, even without hard evidence, were working off rumors. The government, maybe pushed by some offhand complaint, was now more alert to any mention of a secret sale of the tower. And now he was sitting across from a man with real access to information, someone who could blow up the entire scheme with a single phone call. Between the industrialist's careful statements came very specific questions about deadlines, administrative procedures, and official records. Questions that, to be answered properly, would require more than improvisation. They would require actually being inside the state machine. Victor answered as far as he could, but for the first time in Paris, he felt he wasn't leading the conversation. He was chasing it. The decisive moment didn't come with shouting or accusations, but with silence. Silence when the industrialist repeated a minister's name and waited for confirmation. Silence when he said he had already heard rumors involving the tower. Silence when he asked why a deal of that size would be handled by one man in a hotel instead of a formal committee in an official building. Each pause weighed like a warning. While he talked about exposure risks and political strategy, Victor started noticing details he might have ignored before. The assistant jotting down document numbers, the faintly amused glint in the buyer's eye as he pushed the explanation to its limits. The two men still posted in the lobby. He felt more clearly by the minute that the whole performance was hanging by a thread, and that thread could lead straight to a cell. That's when he made the decision that separates dead con men from legendary ones on the run. He pulled the plug. But walking away from a con isn't as simple as standing up and leaving the table. You have to rewrite the story so the other person thinks you were the one who chose to back out. Victor subtly shifted his language. He started stressing political instability, hinting that certain signs of disloyalty may have reached the government, suggesting that maybe this wasn't the right time to move forward. Like someone protecting the other man from a bigger danger, he backed off. He blamed the retreat on orders from above and last-minute changes. He apologized for the wasted time, doubled down on the need for absolute secrecy, and promised that if the project came back, this industrialist would be the first one called. The subliminal message was clear. Don't ask questions, don't talk, pretend this meeting never happened. Once again, he tried to turn silence into part of the script. Leaving the hotel, he didn't look back. He didn't return to his room. He didn't stop at the front desk. A taxi, arranged to wait on another street, took him straight to a station. From there, he changed his name, his route, and soon his country. For those who stayed behind, all that remained was a vague feeling that something strange had been brewing. But nothing solid enough to become a headline. The second sale of the Eiffel Tower never happened. No payment, no fake contract, no clear victim. But another kind of legacy was born. The realization that at a certain point, the environment becomes more dangerous than profitable. Victor left Paris with less money than he'd hoped to make, but with something far more valuable for a man who lives off deception. His freedom intact and his legend untouched. As the train rolled toward the border, he understood a lesson that very few men like him learn in time. Just as important as knowing when to strike is knowing when to disappear before the applause or the handcuffs. The Eiffel Tower was still standing. The government stayed silent, and the story of the con man who sold the tower twice began to take shape, fed not only by the scam that worked, but also by the one that almost happened, and out of sheer survival instinct, he chose not to let happen. The America Victor walked into wasn't the same exhausted Europe he'd left behind. These were the roaring 20s, jazz, skyscrapers rising, alcohol banned, but sold on every corner, fortunes made and lost at casino tables and on the stock market. It was a country built on the belief that everything could be multiplied. Money, opportunities, dreams. For someone like Victor, that wasn't just a backdrop, it was fuel. He arrived in the United States carrying more than luggage. He brought a refined skill for reading people, a rare talent for manufacturing credibility, and a sharp sense that here, more than anywhere else, people were trained from childhood to believe in promises of fast growth. The myth of the self-made man who gets rich off one brilliant idea created the perfect environment for a very specific, almost theatrical scam, the Romanian box. On the surface, the idea was simple, but it was built on layers of cleverness. At its core, the box was just a heavy wooden case, solid, serious-looking, like a scientific instrument. Inside, Victor had it fitted with rollers, hidden compartments, cranks, and sometimes a fake thermometer or little gauges. It wasn't some cheap magic trick. It was an object designed to look like advanced technology, something only a few insiders knew about. The story that came with the box mattered even more than the box itself. Victor told potential victims it was a device based on a complex chemical process, able to duplicate banknotes over several hours. The operation required time, precision, and rare chemical reagents, which explained the high cost and the need for absolute secrecy. He didn't pitch this to just anyone. He chose targets who had money but, more importantly, enough greed to believe they were getting access to a trick the rest of the world didn't know existed. The meeting usually took place in a quiet but respectable hotel. A room rented for a few days became an improvised lab. The box sat on a table, covered with a cloth, like something too important to be left in plain view. By the time the buyer walked in, he was already emotionally primed. He'd been fed stories about businessmen who had doubled small fortunes with that machine, about deals involving European bankers, about smugglers who used the device to wash money and make it look clean. The demonstration was the heart of the con. Victor asked the victim to bring a high-value bill, one he could examine and mark. Before inserting it, he showed some of the inner parts, the rollers, the tubes, just enough to sell the illusion of complexity without giving away the secret. Then he slid the real bill into one slot, along with a blank piece of paper cut to the exact same size. He explained that the chemical process was slow, that the ink had to be transferred molecule by molecule to the new sheet. He talked about pressure, controlled heat, and reactions sensitive to tiny variations. The more technical and confusing it sounded, the more convincing it became. But the scam didn't depend on chemistry. It depended on preparation. Before the meeting, Victor had already loaded the box with another real bill, identical in value and appearance to the one the buyer would bring. That second note was hidden in an internal compartment, set to appear after a specific amount of time, usually a few hours. The clock in this case mattered as much as the box. The long wait served two purposes. It made the supposed chemical process seem believable, and it built suspense. While the hours ticked by, Victor fed the target's imagination. He talked business, discussed economic crises, complained about how governments always find a way to protect the banks, never the common person. He made the machine feel almost like a refined form of revenge against an unfair system. The buyer didn't see himself as trying to counterfeit money. He saw himself as smart enough to exploit a loophole in the machine of capitalism. When the waiting period finally ended, the scene felt almost like a ritual. Under the victim's tense stare, Victor opened the box, worked the rollers and compartments, pulled out the original bill, untouched, and then the copy, a second genuine note he had placed there beforehand. The victim checked everything, Serial numbers, texture, watermark. It all matched. The machine had apparently worked. That's the moment when the con truly closed, even though the victim didn't realize it yet. After seeing the duplication with his own eyes, the buyer didn't just believe. He needed to believe. And more than that, he wanted to own it. Victor then offered to sell the machine for a high price, but framed it as nothing compared to the potential of the device. The negotiation that followed was not about right or wrong, legal or illegal. It was about price, exclusivity, and reassurance that no one else would have access to this technology. Most deals ended with the buyer paying a huge amount for the Romanian box, often with an extra secrecy fee or consulting fee for the knowledge passed on. Victor, always polite, never pushed too hard. He always made it feel like he could just walk away, sell to someone else, or take the secret back with him. That attitude nudged the victim straight into the decision he already wanted to make. Once the money changed hands, Victor kept up the act only as long as necessary. He stayed in town a few more hours, maybe a day, reassuring the buyer that he'd be available to answer any questions. Then he moved on. Another route, another hotel, another state. Time, once again, worked in his favor. The buyer's next tests with the machine would take hours, and by the time he discovered the box only produced blank paper, Victor would be hundreds of miles away. The moment of discovery was always the same. Shock, repeated attempts, denial. The new owner tried adjusting the cranks, changing the waiting time, switching paper, reviewing every step. Only slowly did he admit something was wrong. But there's a big gap between realizing the mistake and reporting it. Any official complaint meant confessing to the police that he had tried to use a machine to counterfeit money. Many preferred to swallow the loss in silence. Behind the scenes, the success of the Romanian box didn't depend on Victor alone. There was a small network of accomplices helping to set the stage. People who played the role of satisfied customers in quiet meetings. Hotel workers bribed to treat Victor like a VIP. Middlemen who introduced the machine to new targets. Each got their cut, and no one knew the whole scheme. If someone got caught, they only knew enough to keep the core of the operation safe. Over the years, the Romanian box traveled as much as Victor. It passed through hotel rooms in New York, Chicago, New Orleans, and small towns where rumors moved faster than trains. In every place, the promise was the same: multiplied money, control over something everyone fears losing. The genius of the scam was exactly this. He wasn't just selling a machine. He was selling the illusion that, for once, the ordinary person had the secret trick in their hands. Not the bank, not the government, not some faraway tycoon. By the time the first real rumors reached the authorities, the damage was already spread out. Fragmented stories about a miracle machine circled among Secret Service agents, cops, and bankers. There was no clear description, no victim willing to fully expose himself. All they had was a pattern. A well-dressed foreigner, European accent, always passing through, always one step ahead of suspicion. And while the Romanian box kept moving, Victor stayed on the move too, changing names, cities, and lives, until the day the country he had exploited so skillfully would finally start to close in on him. Chicago, 1920s. The city smells like factory smoke, illegal booze, and fresh gunpowder. In the papers, Al Capone shows up like an uncrowned king, photographed in expensive suits, hat perfectly tilted, a smile you can't tell if it's friendly or a threat. On the streets, his last name isn't just news, it's gravity. It pulls in money, fear, cops, and opportunists. For almost everyone, getting close to Capone is the same as playing with death. For Victor, it's a chance to test a very different kind of con. He understands from the start that with men like Capone, the usual tricks don't work. There's no room for card scams, Romanian boxes, or fake government contracts. Gangsters don't handle surprises well. With them, getting caught in a lie doesn't just mean humiliation. It means disappearing down some alley with no witnesses. If Victor wants anything from that man, he has to flip the script. Not trying to rip money out through illusion, but planting something more valuable than any gadget: trust. The road to Capone isn't straight. It runs through casino middlemen, speakeasy owners, Small-time crooks who've heard of the polished European who understands money and discrete opportunities. With each contact, Victor repeats the image he's carefully built. He's not a street hustler. He's a businessman who knows financial loopholes, powerful people, and off-the-record investment schemes that never show up in any official ledger. When he finally gets an audience, the room says it all. It's not some regular office. The place where Capone receives him mixes luxury with threat. Heavy furniture, thick curtains, bottles of illegal liquor on display, armed men leaning on the walls pretending not to listen. At the center, Al Capone, big, well-dressed, with a stare that weighs every move. Victor walks in unhurried, suit-perfect, tie-straight briefcase under his arm. He doesn't act scared, but he doesn't fake bravado either. He knows that guys who try to look fearless in front of Capone usually end up broken. He picks the middle ground. Respect without groveling. The pitch he makes is simple on the surface, a high-return, short-term investment. He talks about a financial play involving buying and reselling assets, maybe alcohol, maybe something tied to the market. The product changes with the version. What matters isn't the item, it's the math. Put in a serious amount of money, let it work for a few weeks, then get the capital back with profit. He doesn't promise miracles, he promises something just believable enough that you can't ignore it. Capone listens, not interrupting much. He asks few questions, but they hit hard. Who are your contacts? Where do you keep the money? How long do you need? And most of all, what happens if it goes wrong? Victor's answer is a carefully staged mix of confidence and submission. He admits, apparently honestly, that there's risk, but says he'd bet his own life on the operation. He doesn't spell it out, but he makes it clear he understands that with Al Capone, risk is literal. At the end of the meeting, Capone makes a decision that looks at first like a win for the European. He hands over a large sum, tens of thousands of dollars for a fixed period. The money comes in bundles counted by assistants, packed like something fragile. Victor takes it, thanks him, and leaves knowing he's carrying more than cash. He's carrying an expectation of return that, if disappointed the wrong way, could cost him his life. Over the next days, he doesn't invest a cent. No trades, no bets, no real business. He keeps the money untouched, like some sacred object. He doesn't risk it at a table, doesn't feed it into Romanian boxes, doesn't try to multiply it. The plan isn't to get rich off the capital. It's to get rich off Capone's emotional reaction when the investment is over. When the agreed time passes, Victor goes back to see him. The second meeting feels different. There's tension in the air, but also suspicion. Gangsters don't believe in vague promises for very long. They want results, numbers, proof. When Victor walks into the room, he doesn't stall. He doesn't bring charts or reports. He just sets the briefcase on the desk, opens it, and calmly slides it over to Capone. Inside, the full amount, every dollar, untouched. Capone stares at him, puzzled. The reaction Victor wants doesn't come right away. The mob boss asks what happened. That's when the performance hits its peak. With a mix of frustration and humility, perfectly acted, Victor admits failure. He says he studied the market, saw rising risks, realized the scheme wasn't as solid as it looked. He decided to pull back rather than put Capone's money in danger. The word failure, used on purpose, disarms him. It's rare for anyone to walk into that room, admit they couldn't deliver, and still return everything. In Capone's world, failure usually comes with excuses, lies, escapes, betrayals, not with a full refund and an apology for not making a profit. The logic that forms in Capone's mind is almost automatic. If this guy meant harm, he'd already be gone with the money. If he were just another scammer, he'd spin some story and keep at least a chunk for himself. But he's right here, face to face, giving back every dollar and saying he backed out to protect the boss's money. That doesn't look like a con man's move. It looks like something else. Reliability. Capone, who built his empire on a brutal balance of fear and loyalty, recognizes the value instantly. In a world where everybody's trying to grab a bigger slice, a man who loses a chance to get rich just to avoid risking the boss's capital is rare. And like anything rare, he deserves a reward. After checking the cash and confirming it's all there, Capone does something that seals the psychological con. He hands the briefcase back, pulls out a portion of the money, and pushes it toward Victor. A bonus for honesty. Payment not for financial results, but for behavior. For Capone, it's a show of power and generosity. For Victor, it's exactly the ending he planned. He leaves the room with less than he could have stolen, but with something no quick theft could ever buy. A reputation among dangerous men as someone you can trust with money. In bars, back rooms, and hallways of the underworld, the story starts to spread about a European who once held Capone's cash in his hands, failed to deliver the expected profit, and still had the guts, or the madness, to return every cent. The story, of course, leaves out the part where that was the plan all along. This time, the con isn't in a direct trick, but in the sophisticated manipulation of expectation and character. Victor understood that there are places where the smartest way to fool someone isn't by lying. It's by telling the truth at exactly the right moment. By losing an investment, he buys something far more profitable. The trust of a man who can open doors, drop his name, and vouch for him in circles where a word is worth as much as a gun. The lesson he walks away with is quiet but sharp. In certain games, the biggest profit doesn't come from what you take, but from what you choose not to steal. And in a world where everyone suspects everyone, few cons are as powerful as making a dangerous man believe you're the only one who won't betray him. At first, it looked like just the natural evolution of his craft. After years of exploiting other people's greed with staged tricks, fake safes, and phantom contracts, Victor turned to something more direct, more dangerous, and in theory, more efficient, making the money himself. No more depending on one victim at a time. The goal now was to turn forgery into a quiet industry, spread across multiple cities with routes, suppliers, and specialists. The money factory wasn't a single hidden warehouse. It was a network. Discreet print shops, apartments rented under fake names, basements turned into mini press rooms packed with ink and plates. Victor no longer just copied the appearance of wealth. He was now trying to copy its physical tool, the banknote. The work stopped being improvisation and started demanding technical discipline. Specific weight paper, imported inks, plates engraved with obsessive detail, study of watermarks. He recruited talented engravers, experienced printers, people capable of copying letters, seals, and borders with almost artistic obsession. The idea wasn't to flood the market with fake money in some flashy wave. It was slower, more patient, produced notes that slipped under the radar, mixed into millions of others, generating steady profit without drawing immediate attention. Instead of squeezing small fortunes from one sucker at a time, the plan was to skim tiny amounts from countless pockets, slowly. The factory worked in controlled batches, distributed by middlemen in different states. Every step was designed so that if one link was exposed, the rest of the chain had time to move. But there's one institution that doesn't tolerate that kind of quiet ambition: the United States Secret Service, responsible not only for protecting presidents, but for hunting counterfeiters. Reports started piling up, suspicious bills in regional banks, recurring patterns in different cities, complaints from wary shopkeepers. In cases like this, fake money leaves tracks, even when it's good. And as the pieces came together, one name, or at least one profile, kept surfacing in informant reports and case files. A polished European, fluent in several languages, always passing through, tied to both small scams and sophisticated schemes. The answer didn't come in one big, spectacular bust, but in a tightening net. Agents began tailing middlemen, intercepting mail, logging faces in hotels and train stations. Some accomplices were pressured, others vanished. Little by little, the layout of the network appeared, and at its center, even behind layers of fake identities, one figure kept reappearing: Victor Lustig. When the arrest finally came, the drama wasn't his. It was in the force surrounding him. Armed agents, search warrants, rooms torn apart, presses seized, boxes of notes collected as evidence. In one hideout, they found not just bills, but contact lists, notes on movements, sketches for new scams. Overnight, elegance had to share space with handcuffs. Taken into custody, Victor didn't lose his composure right away. In interrogations, he answered calmly, denied what he could, muddied details, tried to hold up alternate versions. He knew the state often gets lost in its own bureaucracy and tried to exploit that, building a maze of dates, places, and names. But this time, the papers weren't in his hands. They were in labeled folders, guarded by prosecutors and agents determined to turn the brilliant con man into a cautionary example. While he waited for trial in prison, a scene unfolded that would later become almost legendary. The escape by bedsheets. One carefully chosen night, Victor and another inmate tied together strips of cloth, turning them into makeshift ropes hanging out of the cell window. The plan was part audacity, part desperation. Climbing down the side of the building in the dark, counting on a moment when the guards would be less alert. The image of this man, used to fine suits and luxury hotels, sliding down filthy sheets, said everything about the distance between the persona he'd created and the reality closing in on him. The escape only worked for a short time. The press outrage, the embarrassment for the authorities, and his already long criminal record guaranteed top priority in the manhunt. Photos and descriptions were spread around, informants got paid, borders were watched. Victor, who was used to disappearing because he chose to, now had to disappear because he had no choice. But the world shrinks fast for someone carrying a famous face and a heavy past. His recapture was less dramatic than the escape. No movie-style shootout, just the heavy thud of a door kicked in, voices yelling, "Hands up," and an elegant man with nowhere left to negotiate. This time, neither intelligence nor charm nor document tricks would be enough. The case was no longer just about counterfeit bills. It was about a lifetime of scams, fraud, lies, and escapes. At trial, the tone was clearly meant to send a message. Prosecutors painted him not only as a counterfeiter, but as a symbol of something the state needed to crush hard. The idea that cleverness and charm could replace honest work and respect for the law. The seized notes were stacked like stage props for the accusation. Witnesses walked through schemes, meetings, payments. Victor, at the defense table, watched his own legend being taken apart in public. The sentence was long, enough years to turn any prison not into a stopover, but a final destination. Transferred to tougher institutions, he left behind the scenes he once chose for himself. Bright hotel lobbies, comfortable train cars, first-class cabins on ships. In their place came narrow hallways, rigid routines, watchful eyes, fixed schedules. In there, the brilliant persona started to fade. There was no audience to impress anymore, no marks to seduce. The game of appearances lost its power in a place where everyone wore the same clothes, ate the same food, followed the same orders. The mind that once spent its energy designing scams now had to get used to counting days, repeating chores, enduring confinement. Charisma, so useful at backroom tables and quiet salons, meant little to tired guards and unbending rules. The price of the legend started to be collected slowly, methodically. Not in one dramatic final scene, but through daily erosion. Health wearing down, strength fading, a face aging without the constant rush of movement. Victor, who had lived like a moving shadow crossing borders and identities, was reduced to an inmate number in a prison file. Outside, though, the story was taking another path. While the real man decayed behind bars, the myth of the con artist who sold the Eiffel Tower, fooled bankers and mobsters, ran a money factory, and escaped down bed sheets took on a life of its own. It became a bar story, an urban legend, a tale people exaggerated for effect. The irony was brutal. The bigger the figure of Victor Lustig grew as a symbol of cunning and boldness, the more the actual person behind the name was swallowed by a gray, controlled, predictable routine. In the end, the money factory produced something none of Victor's machines had ever promised. Not endless wealth, but the final bill for a life spent testing the limits of human credulity. And unlike all the banknotes he spread around the world, this last bill couldn't be forged. At the end of the line, when your days stop being measured by cities and start being counted by bars on a window, the shine of the stories fades faster than the memories. That's the stage where the public figure slowly splits away from the real man. Victor Lustig, the con artist who sold the Eiffel Tower, the elegant foreigner who fooled bankers, mobsters, and governments, gives way to someone who no longer controls his own narrative. But if it were possible to condense everything he learned into an unwritten code, that code would look like a set of commandments, rules born not from morality, but from a ruthless understanding of human nature. The first was simple and devastating: listen more than you talk. Over his life, Victor discovered that almost no one can resist the chance to explain themselves, show off, justify their choices. In hotels, on ships, in casinos, in salons, he approached people with questions, not speeches. He let them talk about business, frustration, debt, dreams. In a few minutes, the mark revealed what they feared losing most and what they wanted most to gain. The con began right there, in what the victim volunteered. People who talk too much become predictable. People who listen carefully stockpile ammunition. The second commandment could be summed up in one gesture: always dress one step above the room. It wasn't just about an expensive suit. It was about what that suit communicated. Around scrap dealers, he dressed like a senior official. Around small-time crooks, like a respectable businessman. On luxury liners, like a man who naturally belonged in first class. His appearance created a subtle status gap that made others bow their heads just a little. Not physically, but in their minds. Whoever looks like they know more, command more, own more, starts the game with an edge. The trick wasn't to flaunt wealth, it was to seem just slightly out of reach. The third commandment sounded almost contradictory for someone who lived off deception: never argue. Victor knew that the moment a conversation turned into a confrontation, the spell broke. He didn't try to convince someone who doubted too hard. If a person showed firm resistance, he backed off, ended the meeting, and moved on to someone else. Pushing is what desperate salesmen do. High-level con men prefer the elegance of walking away. They leave the other person with the feeling that they missed an opportunity, not that they won an argument. That wounded pride, the sense of "I let that slip," was often the best advertisement for the next mark. The fourth commandment was the core of almost everything he did: sell hope, never just a product. The Eiffel Tower wasn't metal to Victor. It was social elevation for an insecure industrialist. The Romanian box wasn't a machine. It was the promise of control over your financial fate. The investment with Al Capone wasn't a deal. It was the illusion of having finally found a man more honest than the world of crime usually allows. In every operation, the real merchandise wasn't steel, ink, or paper. It was the feeling of being ahead of everyone else, of having access to something the rest of humanity doesn't know exists. And finally, the fifth commandment: always leave before the applause. Most con men fall because they fall in love with their own performance. They want one more round, one more score, one more admiring compliment. Victor knew, at least for a good part of his life, that the safest moment is the one right before the peak. The industrialist is still dazzled, the mobster is still satisfied, the cops have only connected half the dots. It's on that upward curve that a sudden disappearance often looks like just an eccentric personality quirk, not a confession of guilt. The problem is that at some point, he himself began betraying that commandment. Going back to Paris, expanding the money factory, stretching his luck past the breaking point. Looking at the whole trajectory, what you see isn't just an intelligent man. You see a man who understood that other people's vanity is as solid a resource as any financial asset. His most profitable cons didn't exploit ignorance. They exploited pride. The Eiffel Tower, sold as luxury scrap, only works because someone wants to be treated as an insider on a state secret. The machine that duplicates money only finds buyers because there are people who want to get rich quietly, off the books, without sharing credit with anyone. Even the episode with Al Capone depends on this same equation. By being honest in a world built on structural dishonesty, Victor offers himself as the rare, reliable exception and gets paid for it. But the intelligence that manipulates other people's vanity isn't immune to its own traps. Little by little, the mask Victor built, The sophisticated cosmopolitan gentleman always one step ahead, stopped being just a tool and started becoming an identity. In hotel rooms and train cars, that persona worked like armor. Inside a cell, it turns into dead weight. There's no audience to impress, no marks to seduce, no fake contracts to present. The man behind the myth is finally forced to face something he spent his whole life avoiding: the absence of a stage. That's where the myth of the Eiffel Tower being sold twice gains another layer of meaning. For the story, it doesn't really matter how many deals were actually completed, how many contracts were signed, how many stacks of bills changed hands. What remains is the almost absurd image of a con man capable of turning a country's symbol into an object of secret bargaining. The tower standing over Paris is still there, untouched, but in narrative terms it's been dismantled and resold as many times as needed to feed the collective imagination. The metaphor is brutal. If even the Eiffel Tower can be sold with the right documents, hotel rooms, and whispered conversations, what does that say about smaller contracts, political promises, moral speeches? The legend of Victor Lustig isn't just about one man's talent. It's about how entire societies are willing to believe whatever makes them feel special or protected. In the end, the balance between genius and ruin isn't just about how many fortunes he diverted or how many years he spent locked up. It comes down to another, more intimate ledger: how much of his own life was spent keeping a mask in place, a mask that slowly, relentlessly ate his face. The con man who always knew how to leave before the applause couldn't step off the stage in time to escape his own character. The legend kept growing outside the prison walls, while the man who fed it shrank inside them. What we're left with are two legacies, locked in tension. On one side, the con man's commandments, repeated in books, anecdotes, and studies on fraud and social psychology. On the other, the quiet reminder that every illusion has a price, and sometimes the one who pays the highest bill isn't the believer, but the person who spends a lifetime building the stage that makes that belief possible. Would you trust someone who says he sold the Eiffel Tower? If this story kept you hooked until now, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which part shocked you the most.